Hey guys, we're standing here with Yi Tao. He is with the MEER framework, and he's got a tinfoil hat on. I could not resist the temptation to come and talk to him. Tell us about your tinfoil hat. Why are you wearing that?
Okay, so basically it's the last day, and yesterday I was at a restaurant and they were using a lot of tin packagings for one-time use dishes. I thought it's quite wasteful, but also it's related to what we do. So we are a nonprofit registered in California. We are developing methods to turn waste, plastic waste, glass waste, and aluminum cans into solar reflectors, or basically mirrors that are durable, that can be deployed in the field, in agricultural settings, urban heat island management settings, and also water reservoir, water evaporation suppression applications. So we're basically developing a new adaptation framework based on managing solar radiation or excess solar radiation at ground level, close to where people live, and also close to where communities needs to procure and fulfill their needs in food and water and shelter securities.
Okay. So do you believe that CO2 increases in the atmosphere cause global warming, things like this?
Yeah, of course. The original driver was CO2.
So if we find a way to do this, is it maybe possible to skip the thing with the CO2?
So basically the way that this framework developed was through analyzing all the standard solution that's out there. And if you really take a top-down analysis of the energy, material, and time feasibilities, one realized that all the CO2 management mitigation processes are not feasible. First of all, it takes too much energy, to capture back what you already emitted. Mm-hmm. And usually the processes that exist are way too slow to have an impact on the next years, next decades. And by that point, there's a certain thermal momentum of the Earth. The heat will carry us over what ecosystems and human systems can tolerate. So there's
So we need both then, huh?
We need to work on both ends, exactly. Okay. But one has to be careful because there's one piece of science which has been quite, somewhat censored by even the likes of IPCC, is the how much pollution associated with current fossil fuel emissions is actually cooling the Earth and protecting us from the full impact of the heating. And with each assessment report,
they used to talk about that back in the 70s and even the early 80s.
They used to talk about that, and also global cooling.
Yeah. I remember that.
Yes, but after Clean Air Act was instituted, and also since China started to really address its air pollution problem, that avoided heating temporarily suppressed by pollution has really manifested itself. Started to manifest itself, and especially since 2020 or 2019, since COVID-19. There has been quite a few peer-reviewed studies in the scientific literature trying to utilize a shutdown during COVID-19 as a fortuitous climate experiments. And by now there's about 20 papers published in the past 2 years. And there's a consensus that reduced emissions during the couple of months of shutdowns has led to increased solar light reaching ground and heating of the land and the increase in extreme weather events. So, for example, the record of flood in China in 2020 and also in Pakistan and India have been robustly attributed to a reduction in aerosol columnar concentration as a result of reducing NOx emissions and associated emissions.
And the IPCC is censoring this, huh?
IPCC is censoring, for example, in the special report on 1.5 degrees published in 2018. They basically presented a graph, figure 1.5, which says, okay, let's assume different scenarios. Let's say we stop emissions altogether. How would the temperature curve evolve over the next decades? So in order to calculate that, the temperature graph, they have to enter in the computer model a very key parameter, which is basically the strength of cooling of aerosols.
And they're not factoring that in?
So the basic, they did.
Oh, they did,
but,
okay.
What they did was a little bit more like sneaky.
Okay.
So the standard value at that point was about 1 watt per meter squared. Right now we know it's 1.3 watt per meter squared of cooling. But they entered a value of 0.7, so they tuned down the actual value so that when you have less of cooling to start with, when you reduce that, then you have less of a heating jump in the temperature curve.
Why are they hiding this?
Because it's important. I think the people doing this are intentionally, they really want to do good. So their intention is to hasten
hiding data and truth by
They want to hasten the defossilization and the carbon neutrality process. So the intention is good.
With dishonesty, though, that does.
But when they're with dishonesty, because they think that would give ammunition to the fossil fuel group to delay the necessary step to decarbonization. But personally, we think telling the full truth, no matter how ugly and horrible and terrifying, is the first step to really having an honest conversation. So that's why, in addition to developing the science, and we also do a lot of education, telling the truth about the state of climate and how much worse it's going to get, irrespective of how much effort we put on the mitigation front.
So you've probably heard, Bill Gates has talked about this. Some of the Harvard scientists have talked about it. Even John Brennan, the former head of the CIA, has talked about like putting airplanes up in the sky and spraying stuff to reflect sun back in. I guess you guys are talking about ground-based things, but what do you think about the idea of spraying stuff in the sky?
So another motivation for us to do this project is exactly to stop that from happening.
Okay.
For many reasons. First of all, it's known that when you have aerosols in the stratosphere, you reduce the total amount of sunlight reaching the Earth. So like solar PVs would suffer by about 2%.
Solar PVs or
solar
photovoltaic. Okay, sorry.
So your renewable energy efficiency will be dropped. And there's so many scientists working so hard to gain like 0.1% efficiency, right? Imagine like 1 or 2% just cut like that. That will give a further incentive to continue fossil fuel use. So we're locking ourselves into a fossil fuel future. And that's for just solar PV. But there's other forms of solar energy, especially concentrating forms of solar energy, which are being developed. And they're actually less carbon intensive than solar PV because they don't use as much refined silicon. They just use a bunch of mirrors and collect the heat. So that's really a sector that needs to receive government funding. And that particular form will suffer about 15% reduction. The reason being that the nanoparticles, they sometimes reflect the light away, but oftentimes they just change the direction of the light. So when you have the light coming in from the sun, no longer in a straight line from the sun, it's much harder to focus that into a receiver. So that's why the concentrated forms will be hurt by 15%. And that's a gigantic hit. Well, basically ensure the supremacy of fossil fuel for many more years to come.
Fascinating.
So that's one problem. The other is there's a known impact on the ozone layer.
If you spray it.
If it's sprayed in the stratosphere. So there has been an attempt to use alternative nanoparticles. The original one was sulfuric acid. So that's known to hurt the ozone layer. So people have proposed to use calcium carbonate nanoparticles instead. But the original paper supporting that has neglected the complexity of nanoscale reactions that calcium carbonate particles can interact. And then a former professor at MIT, now at department head at Purdue, Professor Ben Sitzo, published paper in Scientific Report in 2019, pointing out that that original proposal is flawed, and there's very complicated chemical reactions of calcium carbonate nanoparticles that can still contribute to ozone loss. So that's point number 2. And there's point number 3, which is these nanoparticles, they eventually have to fall out somewhere.
Yeah.
And in the stratosphere, the transport is such that you inject them, say, at lower latitudes, say equator or maybe mid-latitude, but they are transported toward the pole. And it's over the poles that they fall out, they rain out.
North Pole, South Pole.
Yes,
yeah,
okay. South Pole. So the nanoparticles, they perform different functions in the atmosphere, one of which is scatter light. That's the original intent. But when they come down to the troposphere, lower portion of the atmosphere where there's moisture present, they can also help to form clouds. And that's the basis for say, cloud seeding experiment. So let's say those nanoparticles were to come over the poles and they somehow seeded clouds over the winter. Then it's like adding a blanket over the winter pole that's trying to refreeze, right? So Arctic might have a more difficult time refreezing in the winter.
So it would be more global warming then?
Not global warming, but it might exacerbate the Arctic melting.
Wow.
So those have not been really discussed properly. So there's so much uncertainty in the science itself, and not to mention the lack of engineering to make it happen, that until we have both ready in, say, a couple of decades, I think it's too late for the globe to do anything. That's why, for all those reasons, it's important to be able to do safe forms of solar radiation management.
Well, I want to ask you about the impacts of this, because one of the things I was looking at was studying the solar panels. There was a scientist in Australia who made me aware of this. He said that basically the solar panels are depriving all of the plants underneath of that sunlight. So basically the grasses that would otherwise capture the CO2 are now being deprived of the sunlight because it's all going to this thing. Or if you put them out in the ocean, for example, then you're blocking the sunlight from going down. So does this block sunlight that otherwise would be consumed by plants and things like this?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and I'm very glad that you bring that up. So indeed, in the case of solar photovoltaics, if you have been to these gigantic solar fields, some of them measured like 3 meters long and maybe hundreds of meters wide, right? So, and they're placed relatively low to the ground.
Yeah.
So basically the area immediately under would receive very, very little sunlight.
Yeah.
And indeed, when you have 95% photon deprivation, then grass starts to suffer. So the good news for grass is that most of the forage crops, they tolerate up to 50 to 80% shading without yield effect. In fact, the yield tend to increase.
Really? So they would be able to
50.
do just as much photosynthesis,
if
capture
they have
as much
50%
CO2?
of
Really?
the photon. So the problem is you cannot do too much.
Okay.
So there comes why we have this particular design that you have in this booklet, where you have strips that's oriented along the north-south direction, so that during the course of the day, you have the sunlight and shadow scanning across east-west direction, so that the proportional reduction in solar irradiance is just proportional to the period, the gap, and the width of the solar reflectors. So in this case, we are able to properly engineer the light environment to give the optimal growth conditions to each plant species you want to grow. And there's a recent review literature published in 2021 looking at all types of human agricultural products and their sensitivity and tolerance to shade. And on average, most things prefer 20 to 30% shade for optimal growth. And there's a few exceptions, such as corn. Corn really doesn't like shade. Maybe you can put 10%, but corn, relatively most of the surface area utilized are for forage crop, and also cases like vineyards and olive oil production, and also for orchards. Those locations you can safely put shades, in between the rows of plants without actually impacting the plant themselves. But you would provide a localized cooling of air temperature and also soil temperature, and also the total groundwater content. So there's a lot of opportunity to really dramatically reduce water consumption in agriculture through this technology we're developing. And by the way, we're developing this, on a non-profit basis.
Oh, okay. So, I was going to ask you about the money. Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. I got to run to an interview. But where can people learn more about this? It's just MEER.org.
Yes, people can go to MEER.org to learn about us. So we are a volunteer and also just a crowd-funded organization. We take no money from big enterprises. We refused funding attempts from the likes of Siemens and other smaller companies. We want to keep the information freely open source, instantaneously to the public, so that people on the front line, vulnerable communities can utilize the technology and know-how that we develop.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Yi.
Thank you.